Welcome and thanks for tuning in to the Victorian Aboriginal News Van Talks podcast. I'm your host, Charles Parkiner.
Victorian Aboriginal News acknowledges and pays respect to traditional owners and custodians across Australia. We acknowledge the elders who have gone before, those who currently lead their communities, and those who will follow in years and generations to come.
This podcast was made possible with support from the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au.
As a growing number of Australians tire of misinformation in mainstream media when it comes to matters concerning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, many are turning to media outlets owned and operated by First Nations peoples. This was particularly prevalent during the 2023 referendum, and in Victoria at least, with the increased interest in treaty, it continues to be the case. Joining us to talk about the role of First Nations media in the modern Australian media landscape is Torres Strait Islander and South Sea Islander man Wally Tallis, the CEO of First Nations Media Australia. Wally, thanks for joining us on the program today.
Thank you, Charles, for the invite, and it's a very observant introduction there. I think there's a lot to talk about.
There's always a lot to talk about. Wally, what I'd like to know is, just in a nutshell, what is the important role of First Nations media in the landscape today?
Well, there's a number of key factors, and some of them are pretty straightforward. One, it's an opportunity around telling the stories in our words and making sure we're providing fact in the media and demystifying and having that yarn about stuff. Bringing First Nations talent onto the multimedia platform within Australia, I think that's extremely important. But we're lucky enough to have a lot of our stars like your Jessica Mauboys and Briggs in your area and all that type of stuff coming through the mainstream media. Probably easily more prevalent in our sporting arenas, the fantastic superstars we have in First Nations sporting arenas. But
for sure,
across all the spectrums, doctors, nurses, and in our First Nations media, Stan Grant, we've got many people on NITV, and there's a couple more you talk about in the lovely state you call Victoria there. But bringing that talent to the platform, I think the ability to celebrate our diversity and our culture on a platform is extremely important. I always say to people when it's NAIDOC every time in July, I said, First Nations people aren't just black 1 week of the year. So having a First Nations platform where we're celebrating that diversity and that culture is one thing. From an economic point of view, it creates employment for our artistic, creative skills that we have, and the community connectivity for me. They call this government thing the Closing the Gap agenda, but what First media platforms and stations provide is that opportunity to inform people, have a voice, but also be informed by community around what we need to do. Simple things like language preservation. In 2025, unfortunately, because of all the past policies and the acts, our language is becoming non-existent. So First Nations media are actually there at the forefront, preserving this language and keeping that alive. People still want to have their language preservation, and if you talk about well-being of a person's spirit and heart, whether you're black, white or brindle, knowing who you are, where you come from, and the ability to actually understand your language is an incredible part of that. And I think the more broader scope is First Nations people being part of the broader community broadcasting network. And, we've got a lot of private and mainstream media out there, but community broadcasting plays an important connectivity around local-based issues, and First Nations people should be at the heart and centre of that in regards to doing it. So there are a couple of the things that come to mind in regards to the role that First Nations media play and the importance of why we should survive.
Wally, do you think trust has got a lot to play in this? Because I received a message this morning from someone who had said, look, we've got a young journalist out there at Camp Sovereignty, and Camp Sovereignty, of course, as we're recording this, it's only 24 hours after that cowardly attack by these right-wing fascists on Camp Sovereignty here in Victoria and Melbourne. We've got a young journalist out there not being spoken to by the elders. Can you help? And I said, look, no, I can't, of course. I'm not out there and I don't know this young journalist. But the people at Camp Sovereignty were not really prepared to talk all that openly with non-Aboriginal journalists. Yet I know that in other cases where there are Koori journalists there or Murray journalists, wherever, that trust is there, that the message will be carried accurately and respectfully. Is that an important part in First Nations media being able to deliver a more comprehensive, accurate and truthful story?
Oh, 100%. It is the actual fact. You know, if you asked most Australians or anyone listening to media, if they sit down and say, what's the thing you have most about when you want to hear things across social media or the platforms, it's trust. And the bottom line is, unfortunately, there's a report I've seen and it's coming out shortly from the Whitler Witcher Foundation, is that 86% of the listeners said trust was the biggest thing that they said they get from First Nations media.
Goodness.
In comparative, ABC rated about 30%. So, yes, it is true. I don't think it's a First Nations thing. I think all Australians are looking for, when they actually see things on television, they want it to be true and they want it to be factual. The significant decline over, you know, the social media and the platforms and all this type of stuff in mainstream media, it's not factual. Some of it's hysterical, some of it's playing to the numbers or playing to the behest of whoever's funding that media outlet. But, you know, Australians are about fair go and making sure that, you know, your handshake's what it is, and unfortunately, those things are gone. So the fact of what First Nations media can play in regards to telling that story in the language and the diversity and the straight-up conversations we're able to have as people is one of the key factors that First Nations media play.
Just reflect back on 2023 for me. When you talk about Australians wanting to hear the truth and being the land of the fair go, and I agree with you 100%, did you see a particular change in listeners' and viewers' attitudes in 2023 as this growth in misinformation, and it was obscene, really started to come about?
Yeah, 100%. You know, I've had feedback from a lot of our stations, particularly in capital cities, that once the Voice campaign started, they lost sponsorship in their radio stations. So that negativity and spin and the lack of control of agenda was something that we need to learn as a nation. And I think, you know, when we look back on that year and that 18 months of campaigning, I think we're going to look as a country with a lot to learn, and I hope it's a pivotal point. And, you know, there's learnings from both sides, Charles. I think First Nations people and our leaders who put this agenda forward, I don't think utilise First Nations media enough to make sure that grassroots opportunity in regards to what we were trying to achieve with the Voice was coming through. You know, when I was asked simply by some non-Indigenous neighbours of mine, they said, well, what is it to me? And I said, well, I don't really know the impact of it all either. And I said, but for me, there's two simple questions, and this is where I think we got it wrong in the Voice is, the first thing should be, do you believe that First Nations people were the first people in Australia? And every person I've spoken to says yes.
Yeah, of course.
Right? We were the first. The second part to that is, do you believe that when we are developing policies which affect those groups, that they should have a say? And they said yes. And I said, that's what the Voice was. It wasn't about taking over. It wasn't about a mechanism. It was those two key principles. But the bottom line is it got lost in the messaging. I think the agenda got caught up in a Voice mechanism. I don't even think it was a First Nations thing, Charles. I think it was, wouldn't we think it's good policy and practice that every government listens? If you've got a disability, shouldn't they be listening to the disability sector?
I absolutely agree with you there, and I don't think many people would disagree with you. But if we look at what happened in 2023 when it comes to the messaging going out to the media, and we're going to look at First Nations media here, did Australia's First Nations media get it right overall?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. The simple answer is no, but the reasons why is because we didn't control the narrative.
Sure.
The First Nations platform of Australia in regards to the media was mainstream media.
Yeah.
And that's where First Nations media failed in regards to making sure we do that. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. Is one, the sector for your listeners is we're funded by government.
Yeah.
So, that sustainability and independence, and you talked about the challenges of our sector, is we're not a truly independent sector. We're still at the behest and the capacity of the government, which is fine. That's what the Broadcasting Act is. So I think there was hesitancy in regards to being critical and being open. I honestly think the First Nations media weren't part of the storytelling to start with. So I think it was all individual perspectives. But in short, I agree with you. I think we lost the narrative. I don't think First Nations media played a significant role in demystifying and putting that opportunity forward. And that's the things we've got to learn and we've got to make sure we embrace. But to have that, we've got to have a strong, sustainable sector.
Let's just take the referendum for a little bit longer. And let me ask you this, because I do like to see if there's a positive side to all this, Wally. Was there anything good for our sector pursuant to, or as a direct result of, the 2023 referendum?
I think it's a reset for our nation, and I don't know from your experience, Charles, and what's happening in Victoria, but for me, I hope that the continued silent majority will continue to step forward. Our agenda should not be played out in the political spheres. We talk about the referendum and all that type of stuff, but what really matters to me is, are our mob not getting locked up in high numbers anymore? Are our mob in safe and secure housing? Are we participating in the economy and having a fair go like everyone else? And, there's examples of that for me where I think there has been a renewed focus on that, and I think it's more about the doing instead of the saying. But you're always going to have that right element saying, and you talked about the example, what just happened in your area over there in the last 24 hours, you're still going to have that element sticking its head up. But the majority of Australians, for me, are positive about the referendum as it brought the issue to light. Sure, it didn't get the outcome in regards to what a lot of First Nations people wanted in regards to having a voice, but it doesn't mean the voices are dead. So for me, the positive is that First Nations media now have the platform to start taking this agenda forward. And slowly but surely we're starting to do that. So
what do we do to capitalise on that, though, to really take full advantage of the fact that in increasing numbers, and look, I've spoken to NITV staff and their numbers have gone absolutely beautifully over the past couple of years. But is there anything that you would like to say to the sector in particular, even if you sort of took them by the shoulders and shook them and said, for goodness sake, this is what you now need to do in order to capitalise on this renewed interest in First Nations owned and operated media?
Well, I think you've hit it on the head, and for me, as the shake would be to know that they do have a place and it's time to start doing their voices. It's not radicalism. It's basically about all those dot points I talked to you about. It's about celebrating diversity, having those conversations, but knowing that First Nations media take a place. Like the platforms and the opportunity to share, our joint history of First Nations people and, the rest of the people we call Australians in this country, I think is a significant opportunity. And First Nations media can get it right. And we have an opportunity to get it right. But the balance with that is we can also celebrate our artists and music and bring that together. So we have different platforms to get that message across, not just sitting down and doing talk shows or interviews like this. We can also express it through art, concerts, creativity, our music, our dance, our silent protests and, all of that type of stuff. So I think the First Nations media, the greatest thing is we don't have to be told this story. We are the story. So First Nations media have the opportunity to stand up now and share their lived experience. I've got children, and I hope that my grandchildren live in a country where our First Nations people continue to prosper and are leading the way and part of what we call this great country we call Australia.
Wally, what are some of the opportunities, the untapped opportunities yet that you see for First Nations media? Because really, quite frankly, the market is far from saturated when you consider down here in Victoria. I think there's only one member of the First Nations Media Association or First Nations Media Australia, and that's 3K&D. What are some of the other opportunities out there?
Well, one of the key priorities for First Nations Media Australia, the peak body which I'm the CEO, is that in Australia we currently don't have a First Nations multimedia platform in every capital city of this country. Tasmania does not even have a First Nations media outlet. Adelaide, capital city, does not have one. Canberra, our capital of Australia, does not have a First Nations media outlet. And like you rightfully just pointed out there, 3K&D is the only one in Victoria. I don't know if listeners are aware, but there's 119 First Nations broadcasters in Australia. Most of these are made up in small remote communities with 250 to 500 people. Now, these people in those small towns, our radio stations are sometimes the only platforms. So, the opportunity to hear and emergency broadcasting and, all of the functions that our media play and, celebrating culture and bringing stores and telling people what's happening in the world. Our outlets simply need to flourish and do that type of stuff.
Would you like to see the government take a bit more of a hand in this? Because
100%.
Federal and state
100%.
government here in Victoria at least are always saying, look, we've got the interests of First Nations first and foremost. But it seems that when it comes to investing in this critical infrastructure, which is news, media, current affairs, it seems to be little by the way of the good stuff coming about.
Well, the Closing the Gap agenda, which most of our listeners will be familiar with, every state and territory of Australia signed up and agreed to these principles and target. And Target 16 talks about communications. So when's the last time that every state and territory funded the First Nations media outlet to sell the government messages around closing the gap in their area, to put the infrastructure in place?
Have they ever done that?
No. And I know I'm based in Queensland, I know the Queensland government's never invested in the First Nations media sector, yet the whole idea is getting the message out to make sure that people are aware of these services and all these opportunities what are available in regards to closing the gap. The government plays the critical role in regards to doing this. But what are they doing? They're advertising in mainstream. That's what happened in the referendum, was all advertising in the mainstream. Where was the money put aside to making sure that the advertising was done in First Nations media? Because like you said, the trust factor. How many people have a trusted source? So if you've got people who are like-minded, if we're talking about domestic violence and we got women, we don't want a man sitting there telling women to suck eggs in regards to domestic violence. We want strong, beautiful women, as well as our men, who are leading the way to start driving that agenda. And it needs to be fact and it needs to be true. So that's the same for our First Nations media sector, and government's simply not investing or taking the time to procure their services out to our sector to make sure we're part of their everyday multimedia messaging. If we were to ask the Victorian government and every other state and territory government in Australia, is First Nations media a part of your everyday procurement around communication of your government services? The answer is no, yet it should be.
Absolutely.
Because government's spending billions of dollars of our taxpayers' money into mainstream media, and the message is simply not getting out there and not getting done. And it's the demystifying and getting the truth out there around what they're trying to achieve.
It's also worth pointing out to our listeners that for those of you who work in local government, that means you are also de facto a signatory to closing the gaps. Federal, state, territory and local governments all have obligations under closing the gaps. Wally, tell us a little bit about the makeup and the membership of First Nations Media Australia.
So First Nations is a membership organisation. So every 12 months we get members. We, like I said before, we have 119 broadcasters. Mm-hmm. Our membership is made up of what we call the Indigenous Broadcast Media Program. They're funded by the National Indigenous Aboriginal Agency. There's around 31 of those services who have and are the agencies who service the 119 broadcasts. So we've got these things, and we all have acronyms called RIBS, but it's called Remote Indigenous Broadcast. So for Victorian listeners, it'd be like 3KND based in Melbourne, but yet they've got 9 satellite services which do the whole wonderful state of Victoria.
Oh, I know 3KND would love that.
So that's what it is. So our members are made up of those 31 big agencies who do that. We diverse. We have urban, regional and remote. Like I said, I think our geographical coverage is around 95% of the landmass of Australia, except for those capital cities I talked about and the state of Tasmania. And we have over 80% employment of First Nations people, many of them in remote communities. Like I said, we're sometimes the only broadcaster around emergency functionalities if cyclones or any of that hit. Sometimes we're not just a radio station, as you would know. At 3KND, we're also a community-based hub where people can drop in. Artists can sit down and play their music and learn and get the wonderful skills around, all this new technology with broadcasters and podcasts and, all this type of stuff, which is the new technology and the IT way of the world going forward. So that's our membership base, and our whole job at FNMA and my job at the CEO with my staff is to make sure we promote the key issues and challenges, but also build on the strengths of our sector, and that's important. It's not just about a deficit, and make sure we promote that. And that's all captured in what we call the calls for action. So our sector calls about 10 key principles in regards to addressing those. Simple ones around Broadcasting Act reform, employment, making sure we're funding our services, and we've just been talking about that from a state and a federal jurisdiction. We're talking about production funds to make sure we've got our own people telling our own stories. We're talking about archiving and preserving our language through archiving material and digitising. That's a big thing for our sector. Like a lot of our stuff, our sector's been around for 30 or 40 years, and a lot of the old reels and tapes are about to be out of use and they're going to get destroyed and decimated, and we don't want to have, language from 50 or 60 years ago being lost. So that's another program we're looking to do, and we're doing all that type of stuff. So
you mentioned challenges. And I'm just going to pick on that. What are some of the key challenges facing the FNMA? And then following that, how do you intend to address those challenges?
Well, sustainability, viability and self-empowerment and determination are the key factors of what we need to do.
That's pretty broad brushstrokes.
Yeah, it is. But for me, it comes from I always look at ourselves first. I think we always should not be fear that we need to start doing it better. I think for First Nations community controlled governance, I think we need to get that right. And I think we need to start building on, I talk about bringing the Western principles into a First Nations environment, not the other way around. It should be our base, which things are built on.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things commercially that we need to start looking at and demonstrating and building our own resilience and capacity. And that way we'll have co-design and our led principles. So I think our sector needs to truly start, and we had Converge, which is our national conference 4 weeks ago, where the local station in Victoria, 3KND, was one of the participants who turned up there. That was an opportunity where we had over 100 members individually coming together and sharing their experiences and sharing their wealth and sharing the opportunity. This is a way that we continue to build our capacity and viability, so we learn from our peer learnings and we're ability to start doing that. But the reality is, and I talked about the calls for action, if the government started to invest and fund the First Nations media sector, then we would be a sustainable, viable model. And it's not about, additional money for First Nations and blackfellas. let me share with your listeners and on your podcast is that the First Nations media sector has not had any investment from the federal government for 30 years.
Good Lord.
Not even CPI or indexation. So as a sector, we're running on the same budgets what we did 30 years ago. And if your listeners want to know how much did a bottle of milk or a glass of milk back to 30 years cost, it certainly costs more today. So the ability for us to even operate on that functionality without that investment from government is deplorable what they've done. And, they gave us a one-off $12 million injection, but the sector is $30 million behind actually coming to the starting line in regards to where real growth and real funding should be hitting our sector. So those are the challenges. That's the reality. I know it was a broad brushstroke to say sustainability, viability and self-determination, but until we open up our revenue streams, until we start getting the right corporate governance from our perspective, but governments truly invest in our sector to make sure that they play a role. And like I just said, you're closing the gap. Target 16 talks about communicating to the sector. It's actually one of their deliverables that we're going to do it. We're just calling on them to make sure they deliver on that platform.
Well, what can the ordinary run-of-the-mill person do? Now, the vast majority of my listeners are non-First Nations people, just people who want to know more about First Nations matters, treaty, the voice, all that. What can they do aside from, well, we're going to change our listening habits or our viewing habits. We're going to listen to 3K&D more. We're going to listen to Phoenix FM and their Koori Shout-Out program up in Bendigo. We're going to watch NITV more. What else can they do?
Well, they're very good starts. The ability to get yourself informed to make conservative decisions, but the reality is when we get the scaremongering or the radical stuff, what's happening in our country now,
sure.
The stories and shows like yours and sharing that stuff with a smile on our face, we're not violent people. We're happy-go-lucky people, you know what I mean? And
I'd like to think so.
We've got wonderful culture to share and we've got wonderful artistic. So the more of our wonderful non-Indigenous listeners who actually embrace their First Nations people of this country and know that we've got assured it's talent and it's not going to scare them. We're not taking your house away, all this scaremongering, what happened back in the Mabo days and all this type of stuff. It's there, and we form part of One Australia. Their greatest attribute is to continue to listen to shows like yours, to continue to inform themselves. And what I hope they do, Charles, is that they say something to their other non-Indigenous colleague and they demystify that, because there's not enough First Nations people with First Nations voices to go around and see everybody. But if we can have that one moment of truth where we demystify, we have straight up yarns, and then that person does that to their friend and that friend, it has a flow-on effect. And hopefully we don't have, next time we face a voice referendum or this anti-right march, what's going on now, or this immigration rubbish that's taking place, and the whole breaking down of the very essence of what Australia is all about and how we get on together and have a fair go, that'll get done by making sure that we have media like ours who continue to take the high road, continue to be the fact in the media, and make sure that as Australians we're all enjoying everybody, and in particular our First Nations and our First Australians.
Wally, thanks for your insightful comments and really appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Charles. Thank you for an opportunity to talk on your podcast. I think people like you, brother, are out there sharing that positive message and doing it with a smile and making sure we got some wonderful stories to tell. Like I said, I'm very strong on making sure that we don't just have a deficit conversation, we have a positive one. And our First Nations media, if you haven't ever listened before, please join podcasts and watch all those shows with radio stations close to you, and I think you'll enjoy some of the wonderful talent and wonderful music we have to offer as First Nations people. So thank you for the opportunity, Charles.
Thanks, Wally.
For a full transcript of this interview, visit the Victorian Aboriginal News website at vicaboriginalnews.com.au. Until our next episode, stay safe and stay informed.